My name is Heather, and I'm going to be doing a book review of The Fraud by Paul Holden. The fraud in question is Keir Starmer and the way he's conned the whole country. And I think there's been quite a lot of press coverage, certainly on the left, a little bit in the mainstream media, about some of the book's major revelations. So I will mention those, but I'm going to focus more on other stuff because hopefully that will be of interest to the kind of lefty viewers of this channel who want the ins and outs of what the fuck happened in the Labour Party under Jeremy Corbyn's leadership and now under Keir Starmer's leadership. The centrepiece of the book, its central argument, is to look at the role of an organisation called Labour Together. So, as the name suggests, Labour Together presented itself as a way of bringing people together from all different parts of the Labour Party to be non-factional, do kind of sober analysis, particularly analysis of why we lost the 2019 general election, and to then feed that into the party, but without taking sides in the subsequent leadership election, which was between Keir Starmer, Lisa Nandy, and Rebecca Long-Bailey. That was their cover story. That was not the truth, though. The truth was that Labour Together was a seriously factional operator whose goal was to defeat the left in every sense. So that means expelling or causing to leave left-wing members, but also expelling from the party any kind of left-wing ideas. So there's no left policies anymore and so on, no left analysis. And they had to, because they didn't want this to be known initially, because it would have stopped their plan, they had to do this all undercover. So among other things, as I'll come on to later, they had to get gullible accomplices who were on the left or crossed over to the left in some way to work with. They also had to lie all the time, and they had to break the law, or at least play fast and loose with the law. So organisations like Labour Together, which aren't political parties but which take an active part in the political election process, they have to be registered with the Electoral Commission and to follow different processes, be regulated. So they have to declare donations over a certain amount. Labour Together was getting huge donations, which they weren't declaring. And the Electoral Commission eventually said, well, that was probably a mistake. We'll accept that it was a mistake and we'll just fine you in a minor way. But actually, this book makes a case that it was necessary for them to hide those donations, because otherwise, if people who were members of the Labour Party saw where the money was coming from, they would have had doubts about the good faith of this organisation, claiming to bring people together without any kind of factionalism. So it was a deliberate attempt to deceive. Anyway, that's one of the major revelations that's been covered. Going on, they set up, as well as doing polling to try and help Keir Starmer win the leadership election, but pretending they were doing polling to help the whole Labour Party learn, they also set up these other cover organisations called the Centre for Countering Digital Hate and Stop Funding Fake News. So the Centre for Countering Digital Hate is still a very influential organisation, not just in the UK, but in the US. And what it is trying to target misinformation. And Stop Funding Fake News was attempting to get advertisers, to get companies who do random adverts across the internet to pull their advertising money out of outlets who are pushing anti-Semitic content. So these organisations obviously sound super good, right? Anti-fake news, anti-racist. But as is the case with a lot of these kind of do-gooder bodies, they're actually on the side of the establishment. And what misinformation means and what anti-Semitism means is defined in such a way as they can target the left. So, for example, Stop Funding Fake News was used to defund a left-wing publication, The Canary, with claims that their articles which questioned the anti-Semitism crisis in Labour, for example, were anti-Semitic, and therefore they could go to companies and say, did you know that your adverts are coming up next to this evil racist content, when it wasn't, of course, evil or racist, when in fact the people who were behind Stop Funding Fake News were the evil racists. But there you go, that's how it works, isn't it? So Paul Holden says that these two organisations were essentially indistinguishable from the Labour Together project of decimating the left. They had crossovers in funders, they had crossovers in people who were involved in organising or even staffing both these organisations. They were brainchilds largely of Morgan McSweeney and his accomplices, who is the force behind Labour Together, and they often even shared office space. So yeah, there's no meaningful distinctions. And you can say, well, this what does it matter focusing on Labour Together? Why such a focus? They were an incredibly influential organisation, so they did bring in a lot of money. Initially, not huge amounts like now. I mean, in last year, 2024, 1.92 million was donated to Labour Together. If you look at all those organisations that are regulated by the Electoral Commission, so are not political parties, but are involved in the political process, well over half of the money that's donated to them was donated just to Labour Together. So it's kind of raking it in. And Labour Together and Morgan McSweeney, really, the book shows how they sit at the centre of a kind of network of different relationships between people, between organisations, between donors, and between MPs, many of whom now sit in the cabinet and are making decisions about what happens in our country, and also people who became future MPs, part of that network, as are a whole load of organisations. For example, in the founding of the Centre for Countering Digital Hate, you've got Steve Reed, who's one of these key MPs in Labour Together, and he's getting advice and support from two Jewish communal organisations, which is the Community and Security Trust, the Jewish Leadership Council. And if you look at the Jewish Leadership Council, the guy who was vice president of that is Trevor Chin, and he was not just involved in that organisation, but he was a Labour Together director, and he was the group's second biggest donor, so he was giving them shed loads of cash. This is kind of how, or this is how, the British establishment works. They don't kind of all go into secret meetings, but they all know each other, they all hang out together, they all go to the same parties, they all organise through the same groups. They're just very overlapping and very fluid, and they all know which side they're on, and they all conspire. Because this is how conspiracies work. They aren't these little dark corners, they are in the light in lots of ways. Although a lot of this was hidden, a lot of this was in the light, these organisations, these people, and so on. Okay, so I think if you're interested in how politics works in this country, how the establishment gets what it wants in this country, I would recommend reading this book. It's useful to the left in that it's a very detailed account. It's quite long and quite dry in a lot of places, so I didn't find it a page turner, but it's very diligent and it's got a lot of new information, and it's very much countering the dominant narrative about what happened during the Corbyn years, and also who Keir Starmer is. And so I think that's important for us to use in our analyses and in our understanding and in developing our own political education. I think it's very precise. It's got a lot of sources, and he's got a lot of leaked material, particularly email conversations from the Labour Party, but also other correspondence, minutes of meetings, WhatsApp chats, all sorts of stuff that is super fascinating and disturbing and absolutely disgusting in lots of cases. So it does cover much the same ground as the Al Jazeera documentary, The Labour Files. But I think it would be quite difficult if you haven't watched that to get to grips with this book, because it's such a complicated story. So if you haven't seen The Labour Files, I recommend you watch that first, because it gives you a kind of overview of some of the key stuff that's in this book. The book itself, if you have seen The Labour Files, you will find some of it repetitious, but it does fill in a lot of gaps there, because it has documentation that Labour Files didn't have. It also, of course, can come up to date. Labour Files is a few years ago now, And this can follow Keir Starmer into government and really track the betrayals and the deceptions that happen through government and the way in which this kind of authoritarian project of disciplining and excluding the left has gone from an internal one within the party to one which is now using state power and across society, so the criminal justice system, the police, and so on, to discipline the left. There's massive upping stakes in the repression of thought and speech in this country. It also makes an argument about the impact of the anti-Semitism crisis on the way in which Labour responded to, and is still responding to, Israel's genocide in Gaza. So it makes the argument that that anti-Semitism crisis was something which, in his words, could be reignited at will by Jewish communal organisations like the Board of Deputies, and that would consume everything in its path, including Keir Starmer's Labour Party. And so there was that potential and that constraint, although I don't know what Keir Starmer might have done otherwise. It seems like a constraint he would have wanted, but still. Also, there was a whole thing of guilt by association that had been established through the anti-Semitism crisis. So that means that if you were near someone who was saying something that was deemed dodgy, that could lead you to being smeared as anti-Semitic or being understood as anti-Semitic by the party. And that led to a kind of blanket ban on elected officials, councillors, and MPs going on Palestine protests, and to sanctioning of some of those who did and spoke at them. It also can put what's happened under Starmer into a wider context in which we get leaders who the public come to thoroughly dislike, even to detest. And so that kind of is a part of an undermining of our politics and of our democracy. Okay, what else it does is to fill in quite a lot of gaps. And these might have been things that I've forgotten and should have known, but I certainly felt it was filling in gaps in my understanding. I know someone who's paid fairly close attention to this sort of stuff, probably in the top 0.1% of paying attention in the country, I imagine, to this kind of shit that happened in the Labour Party. So, for example, on the anti-Semitism complaints process, it has, I think a lot of us suspected that there were some people who had kind of a fast track into the system. They could phone up their mating complaints and get people reported and investigated. I certainly feel that's what happened with my notice of investigation. And there is so much evidence of this in the book. So to quote Paul Holden, politically important or well-connected individuals were able to receive favourable treatment through a de facto complaints VIP lane. And Luke Akehurst is one of those who's cited as taking full advantage of this. So he could send emails and say, look into this person, or he could send emails and say, I'd like to know what's happening with this case. And of course, the rest of us just couldn't do that. We would just get ignored by complaints or wait for ages for a derisory response. Something also that I've missed was, and this book is really good at pointing out, is that after the investigation into the Labour Party anti-Semitism crisis by the EHRC, the Equality and Human Rights Commission, Labour had to put in place two things: the Anti-Semitism Advisory Board and an Anti-Semitism Reference Group. So the Advisory Board contained, among other people, Mike Katz of the Jewish Labour Movement, Marie van der Zyl, the President of the Board of Deputies of British Jews, and Margaret Hodge, a fiercely right-wing Jewish Labour MP. The Anti-Semitism Reference Group consisted of 4 Jewish communal bodies, all very much on the right and all very much hating Jeremy Corbyn. I mean, either the right or the Labour right. And they're a kind of mix of those. So you've got the Jewish Labour Movement, which is on the Labour right, then you've got the Jewish Leadership Council, which is more conservative, and the Board of Deputies and the Community Security Trust, which are a little bit of a mix, I would say. And he's very good at what I would call pointing out the obvious, but what is not obvious in the mainstream, but which is obvious on the left. And that's very important, because these facts are not simply facts. Some of these things have been, I understand, revealed in a book called Get In, but that's written by horrible centrists who don't have our narrative. And so narrating them in a way that fits the left narrative is also very important, both because it gives us confidence in our own understandings, and because it puts that narrative out there again. So his assessment here of this Anti-Semitism Advisory Board and Anti-Semitism Reference Group was that Labour members, I'm quoting him, were now expected to accept that the integration of pro-Israel advocacy groups into the party's complaints handling process amounted to making that process independent of political influence. So you can very much see the absurdity of what was going on. So the other thing I think it's really good at filling out is the details and examples of the absolutely disgusting racism in the Labour Party and the appalling way in which black and brown staff members and elected officials and Labour Party members were treated and still are treated by the party. And it goes into much more detail, for example, than the Labour files did about the way in which Anna Rothery was taken off and excluded from the shortlist for potential candidates for Labour for the position of mayor of an election of the mayor of Liverpool. Obviously, we've already seen one of Starmer's advisors, closest advisors, have to resign because of the revelations in this book of truly disgusting ways of talking about Diane Abbott. What it's also quite interesting to read about is the way in which the party dealt with what it could see was the impact of this on its membership. And apparently, so a lot of the revelations about racism in the party started with the leaked report. So this was a report that was written by some staff members who were supportive of Jeremy Corbyn, and then was leaked by who knows who to the outside world, and had a lot of WhatsApp messages and communication between the right-wing members of staff in the Labour Party, making just truly appalling racist comments and also misogynistic comments, also comments that, I don't know, just really appalling on all sorts of levels, and obviously bitterly opposed to the left. And the response to that report was within 2 months of that coming out. 1 in 10 of those Labour Party members who are registered as BAME, so Black, Asian or minority ethnic, had quit. So it was a startling exodus of membership. And this did start to cause anxiety within the party, and they created a strategy. There's a lot about that strategy in the book, but the thing I'll draw people's attention to is that they weren't primarily concerned with being anti-racist. What they were primarily concerned with was strategy. And this applies not just to the response to the leaked report, but also to the way they handled the Black Lives Matter movement. And so, for example, to quote this strategy, it says that this has raised bigger strategic questions that we need to keep sight of. These questions hinge on choices about which voters we are trying to win in which seats, and therefore on the character of the argument that we want to prosecute in 2024. They also pitched this anti-racism as a kind of battle between different interests of different communities, and again, strategic there. So they said we mustn't lose sight of other communities that are a strategic priority for us to engage with, in particular Hindu and Jewish communities. If not a hierarchy of racism, that certainly leads to a hierarchy of communities and community engagements within their thinking. So I think what this book is also useful for is helping us to think through what happened and reflect on what happened and ask questions and interrogate it. And I'm going to just focus on 2 things in relation to that. First of all, people's gullibility. And second, the limits on the way we can talk about anti-Semitism in the Labour Party. that still persist. So people got taken in. There's a lot of examples of people who got taken in by Keir Starmer in this book. I'm just going to cite 3 of them. So I'll start with Laura Parker. So she was director of Momentum. So that was the Corbyn supporting left-wing organisation throughout 2015 to 2019. And she supported Starmer during the leadership election. She was actually invited by Morgan McSweeney of Labour Together to a briefing, a schmooze session, and told all these things about unity and everything, and bought it. She didn't really speak out on this until quite a bit later, so more than a year and a half later, when she said to The Guardian, there are 40% of the membership who voted for Jeremy twice, and then for Keir. They were united around his pledges. These were pledges to keep with the Jeremy Corbyn left-wing platform, even while changing the way the party worked in other ways. She says, now any efforts towards party unity are absolutely blown up. It is dead in the water. I can't believe there's a single one of that 40% who doesn't feel like me, totally despairing and actually quite angry. Someone who took even longer than a year and a half to understand what was going on and who got really taken in was Neil Lawson. So Neil Lawson has been for a long time of an organisation called Compass, which is trying honestly and in good faith to do what Labour Together was dishonestly and in bad faith claiming to do, which is to be non-factional, to create spaces where people from different parts of the Labour Party families can be fucked up as well, so I think we can use that word, can discuss things together, can communicate and share. And Neil Lawson had spent, this is quoting from the book, considerable time giving his insights to McSweeney, often in Lawson's own kitchen on the banks of the Thames. Lawson would eventually declare in 2025, my goodness, just this year, that McSweeney had ransacked Campus for content and connections, writing vituperatively about how Labour Together under McSweeney was a modern-day version of the militant tendency, a party within a party, masquerading as something it was not, lying to people about its purpose, and then biting the hand that fed it. I love that word, vituperatively. I don't know what I can say it. It's a bit of a tongue twister, but it's an underused word. I'm going to try and use it more. And then finally, my example, there's lots more in the book, as I said, John Cruddas, who was an MP for a long time, over 2 decades. And he was one of the founding MPs of Labour Together, but he was the one who didn't end up in the cabinet. He was the one who was thinking it was doing what it was supposed to be doing, what it said on the tin. So actually, Paul Holden, for this book, he went to John Cruddas and interviewed him, and he presented him with quotes from Labour Together figures, claiming credit for, because they did later on, not at the time, but later on they claimed credit for defeating the hard left and for playing a key role in Starmer's leadership campaign. So, Paul relates that John seemed genuinely flummoxed. He speculated that this was a rewriting of history to cast Labour Together as more central to Starmer's leadership than it really was, and thereby cement the group's influence in government. So Paul then asked John whether he'd ever heard of the entity called the Centre for Countering Digital Hate. Again, he looks flummoxed. And he asks, in this kind of flummoxed way, another great word, right? What, do you think Morgan and others were creating secret campaigns or projects or something? It's like, yeah, of course they fucking were. How could you not know? How could you be at the centre of this and not know? So I guess I want to ask, because this is all going to happen again, right? All of this smearing, conspiring it's all happening now, right? We know this. So is it inevitable that people get taken in? Are there particular factors which make people vulnerable? Are there things that we can do to make it less likely that people get taken in? Can political education help? I mean, it's very striking that it's not just, obviously I'd expect people in the grassroots just coming at this without much knowledge to take people as acting in good faith, because why wouldn't you? Because that's what we always want to understand people as being. But once you've been in the Labour Party for a long time, as these people had, once you're set up as a leader on the left, as Laura Parker was in Momentum, once you've spent decades, as John Cruddas and what's his name, Neil Lawson had, how can you get taken in? Shouldn't you know better? And is it that actually these people have egos and get flattered by being included, by Laura Parker getting called into a meeting where she's at the centre of things and she's needed, or at least she's given the illusion that she's needed because she gets dumped pretty fucking fast, right? And the same with Neil Lawson, getting asked questions about how campus works, getting asked for connections, getting his work seen as a valuable source of insight and inspiration. Again, and John Cruddas as well, being involved in this organisation from the start, being seen as important. If you have that ego and that need to be needed, maybe it's inevitable. Maybe it's just as simple as that. Maybe it isn't ignorance and stupidity. Or maybe it's naivety. Maybe it is just the fact that as human beings, we always want to believe the best of other human beings. I don't know. It really made me think a lot about this. And of course, one of the major examples of being taken in relates to anti-Semitism, which is the last thing that I'm going to talk about. So what this book is very good at is, in many ways, it sets the record straight. And one thing it sets the record straight about is what happened when the left had control of the Labour Party, which happened from around spring 2018 until Keir Starmer was elected leader so for about a couple of years. So that was when Jeremy Corbyn got a majority on the National Executive Committee, so could sack then General Secretary, bring in a General Secretary. He wanted Jenny Formby, and then she could change the staff. And so it took a while, but a few months afterwards, you had a complaints department which was left-wing, supportive of Jeremy Corbyn. You had legal people in place as well who supported Jeremy Corbyn. But what happened then was that disciplinary action for anti-Semitism increased. So it's not that the exclusion of left-wing members increased. In some ways, it decreased because they were able to bring local parties back out of special measures, for example, and things like that. And there was a lot of exclusions going on under the old regime. But the specific use of anti-Semitism was very, very light under the right-wing administration. So, for example, between 2016 and 2017, so before Jenny Formby took over, the party had expelled just one person for anti-Semitism. This increased to 10 in 2018 and to 45 in 2019. There was also a 25-fold increase in the number of investigation notices issued between 2017 and 2019. So it's a massive increase. Now, what Paul puts this down to is what he calls the crusade against denialism. So what denialism is when you speak against a dominant narrative. So when you say something like, I think anti-Semitism is being used to smear people, or I think that anti-Semitism cases have been exaggerated in the Labour Party. And so what that did was incentivise, this is how he puts it, I'm quoting, incentivise party officials to err on the side of unfairly sanctioning members because it was more politically expedient to deliver results than it was to properly examine the cases against them. So it's perhaps for the last reason that Corbyn's faction would eventually overcompensate for early procedural failings, rushing to discipline members even when the evidence against them was scanty. Yeah, so many people in so many positions were taken in different ways and conceded ground, and I did that as well. I think if you were involved, things got blurry, and sometimes you were like, yeah, maybe there is a problem with anti-Semitism. I never said that in public, but I said to people I know that, and I just, yeah, it's hard. It was hard to hold the line. I think I at least managed to hold the line in public, but I was perhaps suspicious of some people. I would never criticise them in public, but I perhaps was suspicious of some people that I regret being suspicious of in my own head now, if that makes sense. But I'm not gonna I'm just going to do that as a way of saying this is hard and it's not like I'm perfect or anything. Okay, so I think this book reveals some limits to talking about anti-Semitism even now. And I'll just give a couple of examples. I'll start with its attitude to the Ford report. You know, I like Martin Ford. Every time I see him interviewed, I warm to him. He seems like a thoroughly decent guy, and he very much did not toe the line. I think that was very difficult for him. He exposed Labour racism in a way that was unprecedented, I think, and refused to go ground, for example, on the criticism of the BBC Panorama programme, even when a lot of pressure was applied to him. But he was definitely taken in two. There are huge problems with his report. It was a very much a both sides thing. And this is typified by, I haven't read it for a while. I read it when it came out, but my memory of it was that it said something like, maybe all this tension between the right and left, this factionalism could have been avoided if people from the right and left had gone to the pub together more and socialised and talked together more. And it's like, just does not understand what was going on. He was obsessed with being fair to the left and the right. And I think he probably changed that. I don't think he'd write like that now. I think he's seen in the response to the report, which was a very mild and was too fair to the right. It was an unfair to the left report. And yet it was treated with disdain. It was ignored. And I think he probably sees how the right operate much more now. And I think it's regretful that Paul Holden can't do a sober analysis of Ford. So he quotes Ford saying that rather than confront the paramount need to deal with the profoundly serious issue of anti-Semitism in the party, both factions treated it as a factional weapon. And he says that it's a misunderstanding to say that the Labour left was also somehow instrumentalising the issue of anti-Semitism for factional ends. And I don't think it is. That's what it actually says. And he says that if you look at it in the context of the report, he's just saying that, some people on the left were so aware of the factional misuse of anti-Semitism by the right that they weren't able to see and soberly assess real cases of anti-Semitism. But no, I don't think so. I think that Ford's not just his both sidesism, but the fact that he accepted the leaked report position that anti-Semitism was a major problem in the party, that he didn't interrogate that at all, shows that he really bought into the dominant narrative to a significant extent, even as he challenged it in other ways. And I think we need to see the good and the bad. And I do think that Paul Holden, to some extent, still wants to have it both ways on anti-Semitism, still has a complicated and contradictory position. So I'm going to read his recap. It says, to recap, it is wrong to say that there was no anti-Semitism in the Labour Party, but it's also wrong to say that every allegation of anti-Semitism in the Labour Party was true. Some of the furore was genuine and organic, as many people were authentically hurt and alarmed by evidence of undeniable anti-Semitism that was uncovered. Some of it, though, was disingenuous, as anti-Semitism claims were opportunistically exploited by people who treated a profoundly important issue as a cudgel to beat a political movement they opposed for other reasons, in which they could not best through democratic means. So he's like, there was real anti-Semitism and there was a witch hunt. He doesn't use the word witch hunt. He doesn't use the word scam. And he talks about people being genuinely hurt by evidence of undeniable anti-Semitism that was uncovered. And though people were genuinely hurt, I agree with that, but they weren't genuinely hurt by the actual anti-Semitism. They were genuinely hurt by all the lies and the fake cases. The actual anti-Semitism was so tiny, it's insane when you actually look at it. There was, I think, a couple of cases of Holocaust denial, which is obviously atrocious, but is nothing to do with what happened. And this is where I think we need to be. I think we need to stop mentioning the 10 cases of actual anti-Semitism or whatever it was in the same sentence or paragraph as the anti-Semitism crisis, because they are not related at all. We need to distinguish them. In fact, the anti-Semitism crisis made it harder to actually have a functioning system which could deal with racism, misogyny, homophobia, transphobia, and so on. It made it very difficult. It made it impossible, actually. And that was never the goal. The anti-Semitism crisis was to stop us dealing with racism. That's my own point. Anti-Semitism is racism. Thank you for watching. My hair is a mess. I'm going to go and get it cut. It's too long and it needs dyeing. But anyway, it's really nice to be making a video again. Thanks for watching. Please add your comments below if you have any thoughts on this book. I definitely recommend people reading it, and hopefully I'll be back soon, make another video.